Christmas Eve, 1914. A British soldier stands watch in a frozen trench near the Belgian village of Ploegsteert. He is exhausted, caked in mud, and 1,000 miles from home. The guns have fallen silent. Then, from the German trenches less than 100 yards away, a sound drifts across no man's land, singing. German voices, soft at first, then stronger. Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht. Silent night. The soldier listens. Is this a trick? A distraction before an attack? Then a voice calls out in accented English. You no shoot, we no shoot. The war that was supposed to end by Christmas had been raging for 5 months, and on this night, something impossible was about to begin. The men who marched to war in August 1914 believed they would be home before the leaves fell. In Berlin, soldiers boarded trains shouting Nach Paris. In Paris, troops heading east cried "Ah, Berlin." In London, young men lined up at recruiting stations, eager to join what newspapers promised would be a short and glorious adventure. The great powers of Europe had not fought a major war in over 40 years. An entire generation had grown up knowing nothing of industrialized slaughter. They would learn. Within weeks, the promises collapsed. The German advance through Belgium was halted at the Marne in early September, just 40 miles from Paris. The French and British counterattacked, driving the Germans back to the Aisne Valley, where they dug in. What followed was a desperate race northward, as each side attempted to outflank the other. By November, the race was over. Neither side had won. Instead, they had created something unprecedented in the history of warfare. A continuous line of trenches stretched from the North Sea to the Swiss border, more than 450 miles of mud, wire, and death. By Christmas, the cost of 5 months of fighting had become staggering. The French army, which had entered the war with confidence and elan, had suffered nearly 1 million casualties. 300,000 French soldiers were dead, their bodies scattered across fields that had been farmland just months before. The Germans had lost over 800,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. The small but professional British Expeditionary Force, the Old Contemptibles as they called themselves, had been nearly destroyed. 16,000 British soldiers had been killed. At the First Battle of Ypres alone, fought through October and November in the waterlogged fields of Flanders, the British had suffered 60,000 casualties. And yet the line had not moved. The great offensives had achieved nothing but slaughter. The war that was supposed to be over by Christmas had barely begun. For the men in the trenches, life had become an unending misery. The weather that December alternated between torrential rain and bitter frost. The trenches flooded constantly. Soldiers stood for days in water up to their knees, their feet rotting in their boots from a condition that would become known as trench foot. Rats grew fat on the unburied dead. The stench of decomposing bodies mixed with the smell of cordite and latrine pits. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Lice infested every seam of every uniform. Most of the men enduring these conditions were young. Many were teenagers, boys who had lied about their age to join the adventure. Others were in their early 20s, clerks and factory workers and farm boys who had never traveled more than a few miles from home before the war swept them up. They had been promised glory. They had found mud. The trenches on both sides were close. In some sectors, the opposing lines were separated by 300 yards of no man's land. In others, the distance was 50 yards or less. The men could hear their enemies coughing. They could hear them talking, laughing, cursing. They could hear them singing. This proximity created something unexpected. In the weeks before Christmas, informal truces had already begun to emerge along quiet sectors of the front. Soldiers on both sides had noticed that there was a pause in the shooting at mealtimes. Rations were brought up to the front after dark, and neither side fired while the other collected their food. By early December, these tacit agreements had grown bolder. A German surgeon recorded a regular half-hourly truce each evening to recover dead soldiers for burial, during which French and German troops exchanged newspapers. On December 1st, a British soldier noted in his diary that a German sergeant had visited his trench that morning to see how we were getting on. The pattern was strongest where British troops faced Saxon regiments. The Saxons had a reputation for being more amiable than the Prussians or Bavarians. Many had lived in England before the war and spoke fluent English. They knew the language, the football scores, the music hall songs. And they seemed, to the British soldiers watching them across no man's land, not so very different from themselves. On December 7th, Pope Benedict XV made a public appeal for peace. He had ascended to the papacy just a month after the outbreak of war, and he called upon the leaders of Europe to declare an official truce for the Christmas holiday, that the guns may fall silent at least upon the night the angels sang, he pleaded. The governments of Germany, France, Britain, and Austria-Hungary formally rejected the request. There would be no official pause in the killing. But the soldiers in the trenches were growing tired of following orders from men who had never seen the mud. Along the British sector, the ground ran from the Belgian coast southward through the ruined town of Ypres and past the village of Ploegsteert, which the Tommies, never able to master the local pronunciation, had renamed Plug Street. The trenches here cut through farmland and forest, zigzagging across fields that had been planted with crops just 6 months earlier. Now they were cratered moonscapes, littered with barbed wire and the bodies of the dead. Lieutenant Bruce Bairnsfather of the 1st Battalion, Royal Warwickshire Regiment, was one of the men holding the line near Plug Street that December. He was a machine gunner and an amateur cartoonist who would later become famous for his drawings of trench life, particularly the character Old Bill, a gruff, mustachioed soldier whose sardonic observations captured the grim humor of the Western Front. But in December 1914, Bairnsfather was just another exhausted officer trying to survive the winter. The trenches he occupied were shallow, barely 3 feet deep and 3 feet wide. The walls were muddy and unstable. The dugouts offered little protection from the rain. And the Germans were close enough that Bairnsfather could hear them talking at night. In the days before Christmas, the weather changed. The rain stopped. A hard frost settled over no man's land, and the mud froze solid. A thin layer of ice and snow covered the trenches and the shell craters and the unburied dead, turning the nightmare landscape into something that almost resembled the Christmas cards the soldiers had received from home. One soldier would later describe it as a beautiful moonlit night, frost on the ground, white almost everywhere. On both sides of the line, commanders had anticipated that the holiday might inspire unwelcome gestures of goodwill. General Erich von Falkenhayn, chief of the German General Staff, issued strict orders forbidding fraternization. Any approach to the enemy, he warned, would be punished as treason. On the British side, General Sir Horace Smith-Dorrien, commander of 2nd Corps, issued similar instructions. There was to be no friendly communication with the opposing German troops. But orders from headquarters meant little to men who had spent weeks watching their friends die in the wire, who had not slept in dry clothes since October, who were spending Christmas in a frozen ditch while their families gathered around fires 1,000 miles away. And on the evening of December 24th, in the German trenches opposite the British lines, soldiers began to do something extraordinary. They began to decorate. The British soldiers noticed the lights first, small flames flickering along the German parapet, appearing one by one in the darkness. At first, the men on watch assumed they were flares or signal lamps, perhaps the prelude to an attack. But these lights did not move. They did not arc into the sky or illuminate no man's land with their harsh glare. They simply glowed, soft and warm, in the frozen night. Then the British realized what they were seeing. Christmas trees, small fir trees decorated with candles, placed along the top of the German trenches. Major J.Q. Henriquez of the London Regiment was on duty that night. He would later write to his family about what he witnessed. "I think everyone felt very homesick on Christmas Eve," he recalled. "Thoughts of our families at home were uppermost in our minds. The night passed without a shot being fired on either side. Our sentries were, however, extra vigilant, and I felt quite uneasy at the strange silence. The silence was unnerving. For weeks, the nights had been punctuated by rifle fire, the crack of snipers, the distant rumble of artillery. Now there was nothing, only the frost and the darkness and the strange flickering lights in the enemy trenches. Then the singing began. From the German lines, voices rose into the cold air. Stille Nacht, heilige Nacht, silent night. The melody drifted across no man's land, carried on the still winter air. The British soldiers listened, transfixed. Some recognized the tune immediately. Others had never heard it before, but all of them understood what it meant. The Germans were celebrating Christmas. When the carol ended, there was a moment of silence. Then, from somewhere in the British trenches, a voice began to sing, the first Noel. Other voices joined in, tentative at first, then stronger. The song carried across the frozen ground to the German lines. When it finished, the Germans responded with another carol, O Tannenbaum. The British answered, with God rest ye merry gentlemen. Back and forth the singing went, each side taking turns. Each carol met with applause and cheers from the opposing trenches. Private Albert Morin of the 2nd Queen's Regiment would remember it as a beautiful moonlit night, frost on the ground, white almost everywhere. It was a night that seemed designed for something other than war. Then something remarkable happened. The British began to sing, O Come All Ye Faithful, the ancient hymn that had been sung in churches across Europe for centuries. And from the German trenches, voices joined in. Not in English, but in Latin. Adeste fideles, laeti triumphantes. The same hymn, the same melody, sung in the language that both nations shared through their common Christian heritage. Graham Williams of the 5th London Rifle Brigade was there that night. He would never forget the moment. First, the Germans would sing one of their carols, and then we would sing one of ours, he wrote. Until when we started up O Come All Ye Faithful, the Germans immediately joined in singing the same hymn to the Latin words Adeste Fideles. And I thought, well, this was really a most extraordinary thing. Two nations both singing the same carol in the middle of a war. As the singing continued, the communication between the trenches grew bolder. Men began shouting across no man's land, their voices carrying clearly in the frozen air. From the German side came calls of Merry Christmas, Englishmen. The British shouted back their own greetings. The insults and taunts that had been exchanged for weeks gave way to something else entirely. Then the offers began. Rifleman J. Reading of the Rifle Brigade was in the trenches that night. In a letter to his wife, he described what happened. During the early part of the morning, the Germans started singing and shouting, all in good English. They shouted out, "Are you the Rifle Brigade? Have you a spare bottle? If so, we will come halfway, and you come the other half." The British soldiers looked at each other. Was this a trap? A ruse to draw them into the open where they could be shot? For months, they had been told that the Germans were monsters, baby killers, ruthless savages who would stop at nothing to destroy them. The newspapers had been full of stories about German atrocities in Belgium, about murdered civilians and burned villages. Could men like that be trusted? But the voices from the German trenches did not sound like monsters. They sounded like young men far from home celebrating Christmas in a frozen ditch. They sounded like the British soldiers themselves. In the trenches near Plagestert, Bruce Bairnsfather heard the commotion. Suddenly, he recalled, we heard a confused shouting from the other side. We all stopped to listen. The shout came again. A German voice, speaking English with a thick accent, called across no man's land. "Come over here." One of the British sergeants answered, "You come halfway." "I come halfway." The moment hung in the air. No one moved. The frost glittered on the barbed wire. The candles on the German Christmas trees flickered in the darkness. Then, slowly, figures began to emerge from the German trenches. They came with their hands raised, showing they were unarmed. One by one, they climbed over their parapets and began to walk across no man's land. The British watched, rifles ready, hearts pounding. If this was a trick, they would open fire. If the Germans reached for weapons, they would cut them down. But the Germans did not reach for weapons. They walked forward, stepping carefully through the wire, their breath misting in the cold air, and they were smiling. The first British soldiers climbed out to meet them. They met in the middle, in the frozen wasteland that had claimed so many lives over the previous weeks. Hands reached out, fingers clasped. British and German soldiers, enemies who had been trying to kill each other just hours before, stood face to face in no man's land and shook hands. "Merry Christmas," the Germans said. "Merry Christmas," the British replied. More men emerged from both trenches. Within minutes, dozens of soldiers were standing in no man's land, talking, laughing, exchanging greetings in broken English and broken German. Someone produced a bottle. Someone else offered cigarettes. The tension that had gripped the front for months seemed to dissolve in the frozen night air. Signs appeared along the parapets. "Merry Christmas. You no fight, we no fight." The unspoken agreement that had been building all evening was now explicit. There would be no shooting tonight, not on Christmas Eve. Rifleman Oswald Tilley wrote to his parents about what he witnessed. Literally hundreds of each side were out in no man's land shaking hands. The scene was surreal. Men who had been ordered to hate each other, who had watched their friends die at each other's hands, were now standing together in the moonlight, sharing tobacco and wishing each other well. The frost continued to harden, the stars wheeled overhead. And along the Western Front, in sectors stretching from the Belgian coast to the forests of the Vosges, something unprecedented was unfolding. Enemies were becoming, for one night at least, something else entirely. By midnight, on Christmas Eve 1914, the guns had fallen silent across much of the British sector. The Pope had asked for peace, and the governments had refused. But the soldiers, the young men who did the dying, had made their own decision. When dawn broke on Christmas morning, they would take the next step. They would walk into no man's land in broad daylight, unarmed and unafraid. And they would do something their commanders had expressly forbidden, something that no one would ever fully explain. They would spend Christmas Day with their enemies. Dawn came slowly on Christmas morning, gray light spreading across the frozen landscape. The frost still held, and no man's land glittered white under a pale winter sun. In the trenches, soldiers who had barely slept stirred and looked toward the enemy lines. The candles on the German Christmas trees had burned down to stubs. The singing had stopped hours ago, but the silence remained. Then the Germans began to emerge. They came out singly at first, climbing over their parapets and standing upright in full view of the British rifles. They waved, they called out greetings. They made no move toward weapons. One by one, then in small groups, then in crowds, German soldiers walked out into no man's land, with their hands empty and their faces open. The British hesitated, only briefly, then they too began to climb out. Rifleman Oswald Tilley would write to his parents about what he saw that morning. Literally hundreds of each side were out in no man's land shaking hands. The scene was unlike anything the Western Front had witnessed. Men who had spent weeks trying to kill each other now stood face to face, exchanging names and handshakes, showing each other photographs of their wives and children and sweethearts back home. The conversations were halting at first. Many of the British spoke no German, and many of the Germans spoke only broken English, but language proved less of a barrier than expected. The Saxons opposite the British lines included men who had worked in London before the war, waiters and barbers and shop clerks who had learned English in the pubs and music halls of the capital. They asked about football scores, they asked about the weather in England. They asked the British soldiers if they were as tired of the war as they were. The answer, invariably, was yes. Gifts began to appear. The British had plum pudding sent from home, tins of bully beef, packets of cigarettes and tobacco. They had rum, carefully hoarded from their daily rations. And they had the Princess Mary boxes, small brass tins that had been distributed to every soldier in the British Expeditionary Force as a gift from the 17-year-old daughter of King George V. Inside were pipes, lighters, cigarettes, and small pencils made from bullet casings. These boxes, intended as tokens of gratitude from a grateful nation, now became currency in an impromptu Christmas market in no man's land. The Germans brought sausages and cigars, chocolate and coffee, schnapps and cognac. They brought buttons and badges from their uniforms, trading them for British cap badges and regimental insignia. They brought photographs and letters from home. And they brought their own Christmas traditions, the deep attachment to the holiday that had led them to place candles and trees along their parapets, even under threat of court-martial. The exchanges grew more elaborate as the morning progressed. Captain Robert Hamilton of the Royal Warwickshire Regiment encountered a German soldier who looked familiar. After a moment of confusion, Hamilton realized where he had seen the man before. It was the chef from the Trocadero restaurant in London, where Hamilton's regiment had held a dinner in 1912. The German had cooked their meal. Now he stood in no man's land, shaking hands with the men he had once served. Bruce Bairnsfather witnessed an even more surreal scene. One of his machine gunners, a man who had been a barber in civilian life, had set up an impromptu shop between the lines. I spotted a German officer, some sort of lieutenant I should think, Bairnsfather recalled, and being a bit of a collector, I intimated to him that I had taken a fancy to some of his buttons. I brought out my wire clippers and, with a few deft snips, removed a couple of his buttons and put them in my pocket. I then gave him 2 of mine in exchange. The last I saw was one of my machine gunners, who was a bit of an amateur hairdresser in civil life, cutting the unnaturally long hair of a docile Boche, who was patiently kneeling on the ground whilst the automatic clippers crept up the back of his neck. A German soldier had found a woman's blouse and skirt in an abandoned Belgian farmhouse. He paraded through no man's land wearing them along with a battered top hat, drawing roars of laughter from both sides. For a few hours, the killing ground had become a carnival. And then there was football. The legend of the Christmas Truce football match has grown over the decades into one of the most famous images of the First World War. British and German soldiers, the story goes, organized a proper match in no man's land, with the Germans winning 3-2. A photograph showing soldiers heading a ball in mid-air has been reproduced countless times as evidence of this extraordinary game. The truth is more complicated. The famous photograph was not taken at the Christmas Truce at all. It shows British soldiers playing football near Salonika, Greece, in December 1915, a full year later and over 1,000 miles away. And the evidence for a single, organized international match is thin. But football was certainly played. Multiple accounts from both sides mention balls being kicked around in no man's land. Lieutenant Johannes Niemann of the 133rd Saxon Infantry Regiment described what happened when his men met British troops between the lines. Suddenly a Tommy came with a football, kicking already and making fun, and then began a football match. We marked the goals with our caps. Teams were quickly established for a match on the frozen mud, and the Fritzes beat the Tommies 3-2. Company Sergeant Major Frank Naden of the 6th Cheshire Regiment confirmed the presence of football. On Christmas Day, one of the Germans came out of the trenches and held his hands up, he told a newspaper shortly after the event. Our fellows immediately got out of theirs, and we met in the middle, and for the rest of the day we fraternized, exchanging food, cigarettes, and souvenirs. The Scotsmen started the bagpipes, and we had a rare old jollification, which included football in which the Germans took part. Ernie Williams, another veteran of the truce, described what he saw. It was a proper football. But we did not form a team. It was not a team game in any sense of the word. You know, it was a kickabout. Everybody was having a go. What likely happened was not one match, but many. Dozens of informal kickabouts along different sectors of the front, with soldiers joining and leaving as they pleased, using caps and helmets for goalposts, playing on frozen ground that was cratered and wire-strewn and dotted with the bodies of the dead. It was less a World Cup final than a chaotic schoolyard game, but it was real. Yet the most important activity of Christmas Day was not the games or the gifts. It was the burials. For weeks, the bodies of the fallen had lain in no man's land, impossible to retrieve under constant fire. They lay where they had fallen, caught in the wire, or sprawled in shell craters, decomposing in the rain, and then freezing solid when the frost came. The soldiers on both sides had watched their dead comrades lie there, unable to bring them home for proper burial. It had been one of the cruelest aspects of the stalemate. Now, under the unspoken truce, burial parties from both armies moved into no man's land together. The work was grim. One British officer described walking among the bodies, searching for faces he recognized. "I went along those dreadful ranks and scanned the faces, fearing at every step to recognize one I knew," he wrote. It was a ghastly sight. They lay stiffly in contorted attitudes, dirty with frozen mud and powdered with grime. The soldiers dug graves in the frozen earth. In some places, British and German dead were buried side by side. The Germans, who had better supplies, sometimes provided wooden crosses to the British who lacked materials for markers. And then the chaplains came forward. The Reverend John Esselman Adams, chaplain to the 6th Gordon Highlanders, walked into no man's land to conduct a burial service. A young German divinity student joined him. Together they read the 23rd Psalm, first in English, then in German. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." A witness described the scene. It was an extraordinary and wonderful sight. The Germans formed up on one side, the English on the other, the officers standing in front, every head bared. Enemies stood together in the frozen mud, mourning men who would never go home. The truce was not universal. In other sectors of the front, the fighting continued. Nearly 100 British soldiers died on Christmas Day 1914. Snipers fired on men who exposed themselves. Artillery shells fell on trenches where soldiers had hoped for peace. Private Percy Huggins was killed by a sniper while fraternizing with the enemy. But where the truce held, it held completely. For one day, enemies became something else. And as the sun began to set on Christmas evening, the men in no man's land knew that it could not last. The news reached headquarters within hours. Along the Western Front, from Belgium to the borders of France, reports filtered back to the generals and staff officers who commanded the war. Their soldiers had stopped fighting. Their soldiers had walked into no man's land, unarmed, and shaken hands with the enemy. Their soldiers had sung carols and exchanged gifts and played football with the men they were supposed to kill. The reaction was fury. Field Marshal Sir John French, Commander-in-Chief of the British Expeditionary Force, learned of the fraternization on Boxing Day. He was appalled. "I issued immediate orders to prevent the recurrence of such conduct," he later wrote, and called the local commanders to strict account. The truce, in his view, was not a moment of shared humanity. It was a breakdown of military discipline, a dangerous softening that threatened the entire war effort. General Sir Horace Smith-Dorrien, commander of 2nd Corps, had already issued orders against friendly communication with the enemy. When he learned that his orders had been ignored, he wrote a confidential memorandum describing the truce as illustrative of the apathetic state we are gradually sinking into. He demanded that officers take firmer control of their men. On the German side, the response was equally harsh. General Erich von Falkenhayn, chief of the German General Staff, had forbidden fraternization before Christmas and promised severe punishment for any soldier who attempted to arrange a truce. On December 29th, a formal order was issued to all German units. Every approach to the enemy, it warned, will be punished as treason. The commanders understood something that the soldiers in the trenches had perhaps forgotten. War requires hatred. It requires the ability to see the enemy as something less than human, as a target rather than a person. Once soldiers have shared cigarettes and laughter with the men they are supposed to kill, once they have stood together at the graves of the fallen and prayed in 2 languages over the same dead, it becomes much harder to aim a rifle at them with conviction. The High Command's fear was justified. In some sectors where the truce had taken hold, officers reported that their men were struggling to resume hostilities. After men had sung, prayed, and shared fellowship with enemies, one account noted, many struggled morally to resume firing on one another. Units had to be transferred and replaced before fighting could recommence. Soldiers who had participated in the truce found themselves facing enemies who had not, men who were still willing to shoot. Not everyone in the trenches had welcomed the peace. Among those who viewed the fraternization with contempt was a 25-year-old corporal in the 16th Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment. He served as a dispatch runner at regimental headquarters, carrying messages between the rear areas and the front lines. He rarely spent time in the forward trenches himself, but he heard about the truce from the men who had participated. His name was Adolf Hitler. Hitler was disgusted by what he heard. Such a thing should not happen in wartime, he reportedly told his fellow soldiers. "Have you no German sense of honor?" While other men in his regiment celebrated the brief peace, Hitler saw only weakness and betrayal. Heinrich Lugauer, one of Hitler's immediate peers during the war, later recalled that when everyone was talking about the Christmas 1914 fraternization with the Englishmen, Hitler revealed himself to be its bitter opponent. The man who would one day drag Europe into an even greater war had no patience for gestures of shared humanity. He saw the enemy as the enemy, and he believed that war meant war until victory or annihilation. The Christmas truce represented everything he despised. The truce could not last. Everyone knew it. The men who had shaken hands in no man's land understood that they would soon be trying to kill each other again. The only question was how and when the peace would end. In some sectors, the transition was negotiated with almost ceremonial formality. Officers from both sides met in no man's land to arrange the terms of the resumption. The 6th Gordon Highlanders reached an agreement with their German counterparts to extend the truce until January 3, 1915. A German officer informed Captain Dawson of D Company that they had received instructions that ordinary conditions of warfare must be resumed and that the truce would come to an end at the designated time. The arrangement was honored precisely. In other sectors, the end came with ritual. Captain Stockwell of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers climbed up on the parapet of his trench, fired 3 shots in the air, and put up a flag with Merry Christmas written on it. Across no man's land, his German counterpart, Hauptmann von Sinner, appeared on the German parapet. Both officers bowed and saluted. Von Sinner then also fired 2 shots in the air and went back into his trench. The ceremony was complete. The war was on again. In still other sectors, the truce ended without warning or grace. At St. Yvon, near Plugstert, the peace held until December 27th. Then a 17-year-old lance corporal, drunk on his rum ration, fired a shot that killed a German soldier. 2 British soldiers were wounded in the immediate retaliation. The Brotherhood of Christmas Eve was over. The killing had resumed. High Command ensured that such truces would never happen again on the same scale. In December 1915, officers were under strict orders to prevent fraternization. Artillery bombardments were deliberately scheduled for Christmas Day to drown out any attempt at carol singing. Raids were ordered against the opposing trenches to maintain hostility. The machinery of war would not be switched off a second time. But there were other reasons why the Christmas Truce of 1914 was never repeated. The war itself had changed. In April 1915, the Germans introduced a new weapon at the Second Battle of Ypres. Chlorine gas drifted across no man's land in yellow-green clouds, burning the lungs of the soldiers who breathed it, killing thousands in agony. The men who survived never forgot the sight of their comrades choking to death, clawing at their throats, drowning in the open air. In 1916, the industrialized slaughter reached its peak. The Battle of the Somme, fought from July to November, produced over 1 million casualties on both sides. The British suffered nearly 60,000 casualties on the first day alone, the bloodiest day in the history of the British Army. The Battle of Verdun, which raged for most of the same year, cost another 700,000 lives as French and German forces bled each other white in a war of attrition. By 1916, the soldiers who had sung carols together in 1914 were mostly dead. The men who replaced them had known nothing but the horror of industrial warfare. They had watched their friends torn apart by artillery, suffocated by gas, cut down by machine guns. The enemy was no longer a fellow human being caught in the same nightmare. The enemy was the cause of the nightmare. The hatred that the generals had feared losing in December 1914 had been restored by the realities of the war itself. Historian Thomas Weber has found evidence that attempts at Christmas truces continued throughout the war, but they were small, localized, and quickly suppressed. In December 1916, Hitler's unit faced Canadian troops at Vimy Ridge. The Canadian War Diary recorded what happened when the Germans tried to initiate contact. Attempts at initiating fraternization by the enemy, calling out, raising of hands, and so forth, are immediately quashed by the snipers and artillery. The soldiers of 1914 had believed, briefly, that they could make their own peace. Murdoch M. Wood, a British soldier who participated in the truce, reflected on it years later. "I then came to the conclusion that I have held very firmly ever since," he said in 1930, "that if we had been left to ourselves, there would never have been another shot fired." But they were not left to themselves. They were soldiers, and soldiers follow orders. The discipline that had momentarily relaxed on Christmas Day reasserted itself. The men returned to their trenches, they picked up their rifles, and they resumed the work of killing. The war would continue for nearly 4 more years. 7 million more soldiers would die before the armistice of November 1918 finally silenced the guns. Millions of civilians would perish from famine, disease, and the chaos that the war unleashed. Empires would collapse. Revolutions would sweep across Europe. The world that had existed before August 1914 would never return. The men who had met in no man's land on Christmas Day 1914, who had shared tobacco and chocolate and photographs of their families, who had sung hymns together and buried their dead side by side, were part of a generation that would be largely destroyed by the war they briefly paused. Most of them would not survive to see the peace they had glimpsed for one day in the frozen mud of Flanders. The Christmas Truce of 1914 changed nothing about the course of the war. The trenches remained. The killing resumed. 15 million people would die before the guns finally fell silent in November 1918. And yet, more than a century later, the truce is remembered when the battles are forgotten. Perhaps because it revealed something that the generals and politicians preferred to ignore. The men in the trenches were not natural enemies. They were young men, far from home, trapped in a war they had not started and could not end. For one day, they refused to pretend otherwise. Alfred Anderson, the last known surviving Scottish veteran of the truce, remembered it until his death in 2005 at the age of 109. "I remember the silence," he said, "the eerie sound of silence. It was a short peace in a terrible war." In the frozen mud of no man's land, enemies had stood together and buried their dead. It was the only peace the Western Front would know for 4 more years.